All right. So, I could bring up slides and we could do like a whole slide thing, but frankly, I think it would be boring and wouldn't add really any value. So let's spend some time doing technical stuff, shall we? Okay. So what I've got here is a Windows 10 machine. It should be a pretty regular machine. It's not a Windows Insiders Fast. I'm on Windows 2004, which is the April 2020. The 2000 is actually, it's 20, which is 2020, and then 04, which is April build. So this is the latest build right now of Windows 10. And as such, it has enabled me to put on WSL2. Okay. I'm also running the Windows terminal, which I'm going to talk about as well. So let's do this. Let's start at the beginning. If I open up CMD, okay, that's the command prompt. I open up CMD, I get this window, and I think we've all seen this window before. Yeah, Core Bob on Twitch there is saying that the April build came out days before the end of May. Yes, but we're going to pretend that it came out in April. We're going to do what's called a retcon. That's a retroactive continuity. That's when your favorite TV show goes back in time and says that a thing happened when it really didn't happen. So we're going to pretend that this came out in April because that's when they intended it to. COVID slowed everything down, but very good point. All right. So CMD here is interesting. We've all seen this because we go here to the start menu, the system menu, and we look at properties. We've all seen this before, right? This is the same terminal that we've seen for many, many years. It's kind of ugly. It's kind of slow. It's kind of no fun. Here's the deal, though. We tend to combine the terminal with the shell. The terminal is the thing that drew the box that this is hosted in. The shell is the thing that's taking my text input and doing stuff with it. So this is kind of like fake DOS here, right? It's not really DOS, but it has all these different features, and I can type dir and I can do these different things. And this shell is different from the thing that is painting on the screen. And in fact, if I did something like this, dir/s, it's going to go by so fast that on my side, it's going, on your side, you'll see a little bit of going by because we're doing this over Zoom. You can only hit a screenshot so fast. People who have used this shell, this console, this terminal for a long period of time know the dirty little secret about it is that you can actually minimize it and make it go faster. Isn't that awful? Think about that. If I say dir/s and then I minimize it, it's going faster because it's not painting to the screen. So people who have long builds will often find that the DOS prompt or the log spew or whatever they're doing goes faster when they minimize it. That's because the painting to the screen of this console is synchronous, right? That means that it has to wait for the paint before it can actually do the next thing. So your stuff is slow when this console's on the screen. Even worse, if I make it like really small like this, it doesn't wrap well, it gets confused. Already the console is confused about its size. There's all kinds of things that are historically wrong with this console. Okay, that's not saying that the shell is a problem, but the console kind of sucks. Now, if I run PowerShell, bring that over here, I'm using Control Scroll. I'm holding down the control button and I am scrolling with my mouse to zoom in on that. This is PowerShell, but the frame, the Chrome, the shell around it, the console around it, the terminal around it is the same. That's because the thing that did this, the thing that painted this is called con host, the console host. And console host is in charge of painting this stuff. And there's another shell I can run that we'll look at. I can do things like Git Bash, which some of you get when you install Git. There's also Ubuntu, which we'll talk about in a second. And I want to point out as I run these, I'm getting the same shell. That means that the limitations of this terminal, and actually I'm doing a lousy job of using the right words here. The terminal, the thing that painted is the same, whether you're using Ubuntu or whether you're using PowerShell or fake DOS or whatever, it's all the same. It's old, it paints slow, it's not smart about fonts, and it doesn't do well with control. It doesn't do well with control characters, okay? All right, let's take a look here. Folks are asking on the questions here. It's not available for everyone. Is there a way to safely force an update? You can go and manually update it if you want to, but if you go to Windows Update and it says your machine's not ready, that's because there's a driver, a third-party driver on your computer that's preventing you from doing that. I would probably not force the update. Now, Mr. Cochise is saying leave conhost alone. Well, that's interesting that you say that because, in fact, we are leaving it alone. What they've done is they're leaving conhost alone for compatibility reasons, and instead have made a Sudo console and created on top of that the Windows terminal. So Windows terminal, I can go and run by hitting start run, and I can type WT, is in the Windows store. And when I go and run that, here I've got another copy of the terminal. This application here allows me to have as many shells as possible. And this is trying to really juxtapose and show you the difference between a terminal and a shell. The terminal does the painting and the shell does the interaction model. So I can go and run PowerShell for Windows, PowerShell Core, not quite DOS, Ubuntu, whatever, and I can do it in a tab. So if you are familiar with, if you're familiar with like iTerm or Xterm X or any kind of the different third-party terminals you get on Mac, this is comparable to those. The other thing is to point out that there are lots of other third-party shells. There's a number of them, and I'll actually open up Notepad to show you. Let me open up a Notepad here. Okay, so you've got the Windows terminal, right? There's conhost, which you're already using. There is conemu, there's hyper, there's terminus, there's console 2. I think there was one called console Z. All of these are third-party terminals, okay? And what's interesting about that and why that's useful is then you might say, well, hang on, is Microsoft trying to kill these existing terminals with the existence of the Windows terminal, okay? So in fact, what we're doing is building on top of the conpty, which is a pseudo terminal that allows you and a third-party terminal to build on it. So let me show you this here. It's called the Windows Sudo console, and this will enable other terminals to be awesome as well. This is really important. It actually goes through a whole discussion about the history of TTY and how teletype works, how these things were invented and how they were used, and then a discussion of the way that terminal talks to the app and the shell, and then why Windows historically lacks a pseudo terminal infrastructure and how Windows hooks things up. In the past, these third-party consoles have kind of sucked, not to their fault, but because they've been forced to screen scrape, which is not really cool. And the Win32 Console API is Windows specific. So what we did is we made a conpty, which is a pseudo console that has a cleaner architecture that allows anyone to sit on top of it. And then we've swapped that out. And then this is all a public API that allows you to do these things. What that means is that when you pick a third-party terminal, whether it's Windows Terminal or one of these, that uses that conpty, you're going to have a faster, better experience. Someone there named Anonymous is saying, looking in the source code, which is totally open source and on GitHub, they saw a couple lines of code regarding telemetry. The telemetry in the terminal follows the telemetry rules in Windows itself. So if you go into either the telemetry dashboard or you turn off diagnostics in Windows, then that will go away. You can see it in the source code. The telemetry is not for what you're typing at the command line. It's for stuff like, are you using tabs or not? But all of the things that Windows puts in have to follow the rules for diagnostics data. And if you want to delete that, turn it off, see what it is, you can also go and download the diagnostics viewer to see exactly what is sent. There's, in fact, a diagnostics viewer in the Windows store that'll let you see all of that stuff. And additionally, if you really feel strongly about it, you can certainly build it from source and remove that stuff if you want to. Okay. Let's see what else we got here. Can you get, this is great, these are great questions here. Can you get the Git Bash shell into WT? Yeah, absolutely. If you wanted to. That's a great question. So let's look at that if we wanted to, in fact, do that. So the Git Bash shell lives here. Okay. And if I wanted to get that into the terminal, I could right-click on it and go to Properties. And I could zoom in here. Okay. And I could say, all right, that's how to get to Git Bash. It's in C, Program Files, Git Bash. Okay. Maybe I'll put that down here. And then I could go into my terminal and I'll say Settings. We'll open up our settings here real quick. That notepad there is called Notepads, plural, .NET Ed. That is called Notepads. It's lovely. I'm going to go and take this here. I'm going to make a copy of it. We'll change the GUID. This is not the way to generate a GUID. Git Bash demo. And then we'll go and we'll grab the Git Bash command line, and we'll make sure we have some / action there. Make sure that that looks good. Okay, go back over here. All right, and this is an interesting one. So Git Bash, this is great stuff. What a good question. So Git Bash is actually forcing itself to come out and jump out in its own window, which means that this part of Git Bash, look at that. See? So what's going on here is they're not using conhost. So any conhost shell can be put into the Windows terminal. But this isn't a console app. It turns out that Git Bash does its own thing. It uses a thing called min_tty. So that question that was just asked there by Sans Direction is an excellent one. I was surprised by this because what's happening is that Git Bash isn't following the rules. It's not playing by the rules. What they're doing is they're saying, we're not a console app, we're a Windows app. So it just did what it does, what Windows apps do if I went and added it to Notepad. So then, let's see this. This is great stuff. Interesting. So CDA Scalos is suggesting putting it into a tab. I don't know, my friend. Let's find out. This is good stuff. This is why we do interactive conversations. So I'm going to just take the schmutz that you gave me in the chat here, and let's go and see if this works. Maybe there's a way to tell Git Bash to chill out a little bit and open up there, perhaps this CD to home. Oh, I see what you're doing. What you're doing here, friend, is you're calling bash and not Git Bash. So let's think about that. Remember how we discussed, yeah, the GUID is not verified. If it makes you happy, the GUID is verified as being unique for the purposes of this setting. The question there that Sabunku is asking is that, what does this GUID mean? That is a unique identifier that refers back to some defaults that are up at the top. But the GUID is just GUID-y enough within the context of settings. So if you reuse it, you'll have an issue. But if you change enough of it, it's probably unique. But let's talk about this. Git Bash is a Windows app. But our friend in the chat there has just indicated that, in fact, bash.exe is not a Windows app. It's a console app. So that would give us, hopefully, the behavior that we're looking for. So let's do this. Notice also that I'm not having to close the terminal to make these changes. It's pretty cool. Hey, look at that, kids. Good stuff. Thank you, CDA Scalos. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. What you've got there is a really interesting, hey, nice. You like that? Cool. So check it out. Let's go and explore in that folder. There's two things going on here. There is program files bin. Look, inside of the Git folder, we've got min.g, and in there is Git Bash. Down in here somewhere. But that's different from the supporting bash bin, which is an actual console app. What's cool about that also is that means if I right-click on this, I'm going to right-click and hold down the Shift button. So I'm holding down Shift. I'm going to say copy as path. I'm going to go back to the terminal. I'm going to go here to fake DOS, and I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to run it. You see what I did there? And I can hit exit, and I'm back out again. And that's really important to point out that the terminal doesn't care. If you speak console, this will automatically work. So that is a really great thing for Sans Direction and our friend to figure out there. And a little bit of education for me because I was not thinking clearly, but it's obvious once we do it that Git Bash and bash.exe are different things. Makes total sense. Now, let's talk about why they felt the need to do that. In fact, why does Git Bash exist in the first place? Git Bash exists because the terminal sucks, right? That makes sense. So when the terminal stops sucking, then you need it less, which is really important. But at the same time, it's also interesting because there's two things that are included with Git Bash. There is the console itself that does the painting, and then there's the thing that is actually handling stuff like ls, right? This is not Linux. This is not Linux. This is GNU C, portable C utilities, recompiled for Windows. So a way to prove that might be this. Let's see if I'm right. Let's go and run Task Manager. Let's go and find Git Bash in Task Manager. All right. And let us, yep, see there's that. And if I type like Vim, can I find Vim in here? Let's try using Process Explorer. Because a lot of people feel, yeah, so Sans Direction is saying it's forked from Cygwin or something like that. Exactly. There's lots of GNU utilities that have been made available to us in different ways. Obvious perhaps to you, not obvious to everybody, which is interesting. Let's go looking for it. Explorer, code, min.tty, Vim. All right, look at that. That is a Windows executable with the POSIX emulation and then the LGPL stuff that's included, but it's all Windows processes. So it's not an emulation as much as it's a simulation, which is interesting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and toss that. Okay, and then of course I can get rid of Git Bash if I want to, or I can even comment it out. So actually, you know what, even better? Check this out. I'll just go and say hidden. Notice when I start typing that, I get IntelliSense. There's actually a schema, a JSON schema. So I'm going to say hidden equals true. Go back over here, and now that's hidden because I don't want to see that, right? Then that's pretty cool. All right, so what if I go and run Ubuntu? Okay, so this is Ubuntu 18.04. Here's Ubuntu 20.04. Here's Alpine. Here's WLinux. Here's Kali Linux. I want to point out that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Linuxes in seconds. And if I run htop, oops, I don't even have htop on this one. Oh, is that even, this is actually, which one is this? Let's go and say sudo apt, sudo apt install htop. Notice I'm just using the stuff that one would ordinarily use, and there's htop. And there's my 20 processors, and I've got, it looks like 12 gigs associated here. Now this is interesting because I actually have a 32 gig machine, but by default, WSL, which we're going to talk about in a second here, can only use about half of your memory. I think even about 40%. There's a specific configuration that you can set if you want to use more. it prevents you from basically overwhelming your machine. And also that memory comes and goes, it grows and shrinks based on what you're doing. So that is really Linux. In fact, if I go out here and say LSB release -A, we can see that that's Ubuntu 18.04, and that's cool. Coelho is saying it defaults to 80%, which is troublesome. WSML memory config. That is a great question. There's a section here about memory reclaim for you to check out, Coelho, which talks about when memory reclamation was added. I want to check on that, okay? And then it actually will tell you when it reports back to the host, it could then free it. And you can go and run a test of your own, and you can go and say, free-h, go and see. Let's see if we can try that over here. All right, so I can see what's going on in my memory and my swap. And I will absolutely, Amsabunko, I will go and check out how that works. And then I want to show you, if you go down at the bottom here, we can talk about running compact memory. So if we look here and we say Taskman, and we look at memory right now, I'm going to go ahead and sort by RAM right here. You can see on my system here, we're only really using 800 megs in our VM mem because, in fact, I haven't done anything. So there's 12 megs as far as cores. There's my cores, 20. So I'm showing the same number of cores in both places. So I've got a 20-core machine, and I've got 20 cores in Linux. I've got 32 gigs, but I've only got a limited amount visible here. And then, of course, if I was going to go and say something like compact memory, it looks like it doesn't want me to do that right now. I can control the memory that's being used by this VMM. Now, let's point this out here. VMM is kind of opaque. Why is that opaque? Well, let's back up and talk about the goal of what we were trying to do with WSL. So we saw how Bash lets me run things like Vim, but it's not really Linux and it's not really Vim, but it feels comfortable, but it's still Windows. .NET Ed is asking, you no longer need to enable Hyper-V. So you don't need a Windows 10 Pro SKU anymore. You need Windows Home, which is what everyone has. So you don't need Pro. You don't need Hyper-V, the feature, but you do need a hypervisor. Okay? And if you go into your features, programs and features, and you go into turn Windows features on and off, this is a little bit confusing, and it's not my fault. There's Hyper-V, which is the whole Hyper-V platform and all that stuff. You do not need that checked. What you need is a subsystem for Linux, and you need this virtual machine platform. If you have Windows 10 Home, you will not have Hyper-V. You won't be able to open up the Hyper-V thing. And in fact, if I opened up Hyper-V right now, this doesn't even show up. Like, this is not the same thing, okay? AdLangX is saying, does it park a virtual Linux instance in memory? Seems like a gig is a lot. No, it does not. Notice here I have no virtual machines. Let's go back out here and I'll show you how to control this so you don't feel bad about the memory that's being used or not used. So this is all great questions and I appreciate those. Let me close all these here. And I'm going to say WSL-list-V. Okay. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, 7 VMs running. But look at this one here. See how Alpine is version 1. The original version of Windows Subsystem for Linux was interesting in that if I go and say WSL-D for distro, and I say Alpine, we'll go ahead and run Alpine. And I'll hit like, I don't think do we have top? The guy just ran top, okay? Now, let's go and look at our task manager. And we see something interesting here. You see it says BusyBox. That's part of Alpine. Everything is a BusyBox terminal, a BusyBox process within the context of Alpine. So that is what's called a Picot process. A Picot process is a tiny fake process. It's a Windows process, Picot meaning small. Historically in Windows, processes are a big deal. If you fire up a process, it's like fork. blah, and that process gets a copy of the environment. And copying processes and forking processes in Windows as an architectural decision from 30 years ago is a big deal. So Picot processes were made to allow one to do forks. Forks in Linux are nothing. Forks are like, shoot, fork. People in Linux like doing their pipes and stuff because they can go fork, 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 and everything is just cool. So good thing about this is I can see it in the task manager. There's no Linux kernel, though. When I go and do things like ls and file system access has to happen, Linux at the user mode needs to make a syscall, a system call in C to some part of the kernel. And what happens with WSL1 is WSL1 is being lied to. We are faking a Linux kernel, okay? The faking of a Linux kernel means that when someone wanted to do that file system access, the Windows kernel got involved. Mr. Tortoise, if WSL list -v doesn't work for you, you may have an older version. You may be on Windows Insider Slow. You may not have upgraded yet to the latest version of Windows. If you hit WinVer, again, Windows Ver, if you are on version 2004, you'll have that -list-v. Okay. So, and you can prove it, of course, also by running your stuff. And if you know you're on WSL1, if you run Task Manager and you see your processes. So go run Vim and see if you find Vim in the Task Manager, then you're on WSL1. Okay, WSL1 has some benefits because it's basically running the user mode stuff on top of Windows. WSL1's Windows file system access is fast. So what that means is, if I come out here, and I go to see that I'm at Mount C. I'm on the Mount C, and I can run around and go to like my Windows desktop. This file system access is quite fast. Okay. So if you are doing work and your source code is on the C drive, the Windows C drive, WSL1 would be a great environment, great system. But if you are over here, if you are in the Linux file system on WSL1, then you are going to not have awesome speed. You're going to have suboptimal speed. That's because WSL1 has a lot of file system layering. That's why WSL2 was made. If we go here and we say WSL --list, I want to point out again to AdLangX, who was concerned about running stuff and taking up memory. I can go and say WSL --shutdown, and they're all gone. There's no memory being used up right now. It just works. I can go in here. There's no memory being used up. It's just there and it's chilling. Okay. But if I say WSL by itself, it's going to go and run the default, the one marked by a star here. When I hit WSL 1, 1000, 2, so about a second and a half, I've got that started up. That right there is using about 400 megs. That is a utility VM. That's not booting up Hyper-V. A virtual machine is like 30 gigs and like, it's a thing. This is focused on starting up like that. That thing started up in a second. I want to be able to open Linux without thinking about it, without it being a big deal. Okay, and I have total control over the life cycle. They'll go away after they're not being used. They get cleaned up. All of that stuff is really, really important. Yeah, so David Ballone is asking, how do you add a distro? That's a great question. I skipped that part, and thank you for calling me out on it. What I can do is I can do it two ways. First, I can go to the Windows Store and literally just type Linux. And I can pick one of the Linux. This one is the only one that costs money. It's really, really cool. I think it's like $10, but it's basically an optimized version of WSL, a custom version. But there's also free, lots of Ubuntu. All of these are free. Ubuntu is the default. LTS versions are a good thing. Debian, you can do all kinds of good stuff. Or you can go WSL, and we're going to go and look at the help here. You can import a distribution. So if you have a friend who has a Linux distro that makes you happy, you can go WSL-export, get a tar file, they can give it to you, and you can then import that one as well, okay? Subunku is saying, what can VMM not do compared to a full-blown VM? VMM's job, its existence, is to get WSL coming and going. It's more flexible. What's the word? It compacts and expands. It's the WSL utility VM manager. It's not about what it can't do. It's about what its goal is to do. Its goal is to not be Hyper-V, which is the point. Now, if we go over here and we say WSL, and then I say like htop or whatever, all of that is going to be hidden and managed inside of that VM mem. What this means, though, is that there is, in fact, a real Linux kernel, and this is important. There is a WSL Linux kernel, WSL Linux kernel GitHub. This is the source code for the Linux kernel being used in WSL2. Okay, so you can go in here, and what this is an LTS release. Okay, and you can see the work that's being done on the next version. You can follow their process. This is the Linux kernel that is LTS. It's not like a latest Linux kernel. Now, you have full control, though. If you want to compile your own kernel and do fun stuff, you can do that. It's just a file on the disk. So that's important to note. They'll all use that same kernel unless you decide to go and add your own and do your own thing. But here's some of the cool stuff that you could potentially do. So let's see which one that we're looking at here. WSL release-A. Okay, we're on Ubuntu. Yeah, it's super small. Now, check this out. CD tilde. This is the Linux file system. This is important. WSL2's file system support access speed is 10 times faster than WSL1 when you're on the Linux file system. Okay, so that's really important. If you are using WSL2, but you're doing work on Mount C, you will be disappointed in your file system access because you're actually talking to a mount point that's a network mount. It's a network mount back to yourself. Okay, that means there's too many layers. So if you're doing like node modules type stuff, if you're doing a bunch of tiny little file system access things, you're going to hate life. If you want your files on the Windows file system, WSL1, if you want raw speed, a real Linux kernel, all the benefits, stay over here. So Maestro is asking, how do I code a web API but have it debug and run in WSL? Great question. Let's do this. Make a folder. It's empty. Note where we are. We are on the Linux file system. I'll just use .NET New Web API. We'll go and create one. Now, notice what I'm doing here. Let's go and say which .NET. This is using a Linux install of .NET right here. Okay, we're not using the Windows install of .NET, so I should probably confirm what version I think I'm using. Version 3.01. That's cool. I can go and say .NET Run. Okay, and then I can go and grab my browser. And let's go and say localhost 5000. Actually, that's a funny one. So this is interesting. I've been having an issue with this. If you've ever done, they're called service workers. Notice how this brought up a totally unexpected page. That's because I run my podcast site on .NET, and I run it using a service worker. And that service worker tends to stick around because I wanted my site available offline. And unfortunately, I never remember, maybe one of you can help me, how to delete the service worker to have it let go so that I can turn off this issue. Under shoot, is it under applications, you said? No, it's not under apps. I think it's in settings. Application tab. Application tab. In DevTools, cool. So obnoxious. It's very frustrating. Yeah, I need to unregister it. You're exactly right. Which one of these, friends? Go back and hit escape, yeah. This happens to me like twice a week. You think I'd remember it. It's there at the top. Oh, there it is. Look at that. Unregister. Good job, everybody. So this is a good reminder. Okay, thank you for that, friends. So what they're showing out is that service worker is stuck there. That's super obnoxious and annoying. Thank you for fixing that. And now we can go back to our regularly scheduled program, which is super annoying. Okay. What is our default? There we go. Yeah, it's awful. It's very frustrating. So this is saying, I think it's API/values. I never remember the default. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try something interesting to show Maestro how this works. I'm going to hit code dot. And what we're going to do is from Linux, run Visual Studio Code. But look. It just said updating VS Code server. See? Updating VS Code server. It split VS Code in half. And now it is downloading the Linux pieces while still running the Windows stuff. Bjorn Fjukstad is asking, can I access the Linux file system for Windows? That's a great question. Explorer.exe dot, just like I said, code dot, hit enter. Watch this, kids. Look at that. Yes, you can, because it's showing up. Slider bar thingy, it's so obnoxious. Ugh. Right here. Look at that. Presents back to itself. Now, let's look here. What's going on is that Visual Studio Code knows that it's remote. And in fact, I can prove it by saying file, open file. Look at this. That is the Linux file system. That's different from if I say show local, which is the local file system. So half of Visual Studio, I'm glad that your head is exploding. I don't want you to hurt yourself, but it makes me happy. Look at this. I'm going to hit HTOP. Look, there's VS Code server. The headless part of VS Code is running on the server in Linux. And the client side, the front end is here in VS Code. So that means I can go and open up my weather forecast. Oh, there we go. Controller, what is it? Controller/weather forecast. Let's go back and run it. What is this witchcraft? It's the new Microsoft, kids. It's crazy stuff. Yes, that is coming soon for Visual Studio proper. I can never remember this. What are we thinking here? Let's look at the startup. Map controllers. I always get this wrong. Weather forecast. It's either API or it's /weather forecast. Look at this. I can do all these amazing things with Linux and Windows, but I can't spell weather. There you go. Isn't that cool? Mr. Tortoise is saying, is that because VS Code is Electron or there's something special built for it? It actually has nothing to do with it being built for Electron. In fact, what it's doing is it's simply splitting the front end that draws the text and the back end that is going and talking to like IntelliCode as an example. Let's try this. See how we've got this logger option and I go logger. What is the thing when I hit dot that pops this down? What is the thing that makes IntelliCode? That's called language services. So at that moment there, when I go dot, who did that? Well, in this case, Linux did that. Okay, here's a way to think about this that's even more insane. That's even cooler. We've been doing this in .NET, but you can see that I have .NET installed here in Linux. So that's somehow less interesting. But I don't have Go installed, the Go language. And if I go to the Windows PowerShell command prompt, I in fact don't have Go installed here. Actually, I'm going to interrupt add lang x there. He's saying, don't try to drag files to the Linux directories and expect them to be available. I'm going to gently push back on that. That's not true anymore. It used to be true in the early days, but not anymore. In fact, I could go and open up Notepad, and I could bring Notepad over here, which has now been updated. I'll just go ahead and drag programs here, and I want to point out a couple of things. I can decide in Notepad now whether or not it's Windows CRLF or not, but I could also make a file on my desktop. Okay, and let's make a file. We'll just say new item, text document, fufu.txt. Okay, I'm going to open it, and then I'm going to say, hey, this is a document in Windows. It's sitting on the Windows desktop. I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to drag it over into the Linux file system. Okay, there's fufu.txt. Now, what I can do is I can go back out to Ubuntu and I can see that fufu.txt is there. I can cat it, and I can even go in Vim and edit it. I can then say, this is some text in Linux, save that. Okay, come back over here and open up that text file in Windows. Did I actually save it? Okay, there we go. Notepad.exe. Oops. .exe. And I can see that text. The reason that that works and why it was a problem, and add lang x is pointing out that this was in fact a problem. The issue was before, Windows and Linux didn't have any way to know that files were changing. So to their point, you would change a thing and then no one would tell Linux because the Windows file system changed it. Here, the trick is when you are in Windows and you're talking to this, you're actually talking over the network. There's a boundary, right? There's a network boundary to cross over. This is called a Plan 9 server. This is a file server that's allowing us to go and edit our code in both places. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have to think about your line feeds. You'll notice here we're still on Unix LF, so we had to think about that. But now that you can see that that's just way, way, way better. So definitely check that out. It's pretty fantastic. Carl Codes is saying, I'm not brave enough to try Insiders on their main dev machine. I would encourage you to try Insiders slow. I think it's a good thing. And I also agree with .NET Ed that disabling the Windows Store is a bad policy, and it shows a lot of ignorance on the part of IT, but you can re-enable it if you have local administrator. Maestro is asking about ligatures in Notepad. This is Notepads, which does not have ligatures. And if I bring up notepad.exe, I do have ligatures only because that's my default font is a ligature-enabled font. The font that I'm using right here is Cascadia Code. Ligatures are an interesting thing because if I said something like this, right, or something like that, or something like this, www, I get a glyph. I do not use Notepad++. Add lang x is saying, I'm not a fan of Notepad++ for a very simple reason. It's not pretty. I like attractive applications. I like an app to be good looking. And this app here is my new favorite. It's called Notepads. Notepads, plural. I got that in the Windows Store. I use Notepad 2, which is one better than Notepad. But Notepad++ is unattractive. And I don't like the way it does its tabs. So I would encourage you to check that out, in fact. All right. Random thing, some folks farther back in the chat are saying that they are having issues with snip and sketch. I use Shift Windows S, and then I can go and make a snip. Shift Windows S is now built into Windows and gives you a built-in snipper. The other thing that you get with Windows 10 now is if you hit Windows and V, not Control V, but Windows V, you get a built-in clipboard manager as well, which is pretty cool. Okay. This idea that I could go back here, let's go back and let's do this again, code dot, run my application, mess around with my application. Yes, it's like Ditto, in fact. I could do this kind of work inside of VS Code. Coming soon, if you take a look at the .NET talk that I did at Microsoft Build, it's free and it's online. We're adding direct WSL support from Visual Studio 2019. You just hit F5 and it'll work. It's lovely. And what I can also do here, if you notice, I just pressed F5. Check this out. So here we're going to go and I think we said it was weather forecast. I haven't set up my my SSL certs yet. Let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here. There you go. So here I'm in a browser on Windows, on Visual Studio Code, on Windows, doing debugging interactively, and I've now dropped into a breakpoint. And there's my watch window, my call stack, all inside of Visual Studio Code, which is pretty sweet. All right. That will be in Visual Studio proper, Visual Studio Senior. I'm not sure what we're calling it. Let's give 2 minutes to give feedback to Scott. Let's make sure that we do that. Make sure you do your feedback. Excellent. Further away than Europe. Yes, I've been to Manchester. How convenient. Love it. Love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. Good job, everybody. Excellent. Cool. So, yeah. A lot of cool stuff there. Let's recap. Let's recap. A terminal is not a shell. You can use the Windows terminal if it makes you happy, but you can always use conemu and hyper and a ton of other great fun things. You can get WSL2 now on 2004 version of Windows. In the newer Insiders builds in the future, you're going to see something interesting where turns out next to this PC is going to be a little Linux tux. We're going to have a little penguin there. So Linux is going to show up there as well. Ooh, one thing we didn't talk about was Docker. Oh my goodness. Docker Desktop, what a joy. Docker Desktop is lovely. Let's go ahead and fire that up. And I'm going to bring it on my one machine and bring it over here. Docker Desktop has a feature, if you go under Resources and WSL Integration, look at this, where you can actually set up Docker for your WSL2 distributions, okay? This is super helpful because that means I can go out here. I'm in Linux. Here's a question here. So Vaji Fabilov is saying, note to those running code insiders. Oh, I see. Your point is if you are running insiders, you start it like this as opposed to starting it like this. Yes, that is absolutely true. You can run them side by side. Docker images. I can see my Docker images from Linux. I can then go over here and I'm in Windows and I could say Docker images. And I can see the exact same ones. That's because the context is shared. Now here's something really clever. You thought your brain exploded before. Okay, you ready for this? Remember when we said WSL-list-v. How does Docker work? Docker works because it is its own WSL2 distribution. I am, in fact, running Docker for Windows. Docker for Windows sets up its own Docker distribution, and then Docker Desktop Data handles mount points, and then they are hidden inside of the Windows terminal, although you can certainly go into them if you want to. And that allows me to do things like this. Let's go to my Windows machine. Notice my fancy prompt, which is just lovely. Look at that. Shows my Git branch and that I have 2 items that I'm working on. And I went and I made Docker test. So I'm going to say Docker test. And this is interesting. This is a PS1. What that is that is a PowerShell core script. Notice the shebang at the top there that makes it run on Linux as well. And I'm going to say Docker test. So what that's going to do now is on Windows, I am using the native Hyper-V Docker stuff on Windows. This works on Windows Home. You can run Docker now on Windows Home, which is great for students and folks that don't want to pay for Pro on their personal machines. And I'm actually going to go and build, and I'm doing the build inside of the container. So I don't have .NET doing the work on my Metal here. The build is happening inside of Docker. Then I'm actually going to go and run my unit tests in Docker, and I can detect that I'm in Docker, so I can even do headless builds if I wanted to put in, like right now I'm going to skip my Selenium builds. While that is running, actually, I want to take a look at this helpful comment that was put in here. Look at that, yeah. Explaining exactly why WSL1 and WSL2 have these boundary issues, as well as why caching can be a problem. Incredibly detailed. I would encourage you to check out that. Very, very clear. This is the takeaway. If it is all possible, store your projects in the Linux file system. That'll be faster than anything. What I'm doing here is I'm actually being selfish, and what I'm doing is I'm keeping my stuff on the Windows file system, but I'm using Docker to go and do the build and the test. So look, I just ran my tests. I skipped 4 of them because I don't run browser and Selenium tests inside of Docker, which is really cool. I did all of these tests. These are all functional and unit tests. The link is, in fact, in the chat, add langx. It's just above you. So that link is already there. I'll put it there again if you want. Yeah, there it is. It's right above there. Okay, so that Docker stuff works right now. Now, remember before I was making a comment about how I don't have Go on my machine. I wanted to point that out really briefly, and then we can do some questions, and I have to go to my next thing. Okay, here we go. Check this out. So I don't have Go, but I want to do something in Go. So I'm going to hit code dot. I'm going to fire this up. I'm on Windows. Everything's fine. And then Visual Studio is going to say, hang on a second. There's a developer container here. Do you want to develop in a container? I will say reopen in container. Watch the lower left corner here. Look at this. Starting a dev container. What's going on? What it's doing is it has got a folder called dev container with a Docker file in it. That Docker file knows how to set up Linux with Go. But I don't have Go installed. Very important. I do not have Go installed. So in fact, remember how we talked about how Visual Studio splits in half? Go support is installed in the container. So Visual Studio Code runs in Windows. Part of Visual Studio Code server runs locally in Windows. Another separate part, the language extensions for Go are running in the container. Go is installed only in the container. Okay. What if I wanted to open up a terminal? Yes. See, I'm making heads explode left and right. Look where I am at now. I'm in a folder called Workspaces in VS Code in the container. So I've now opened up a terminal in Bash inside of the container. Okay. So we are sitting here in a Docker container doing some stuff. Now, when I go and say IO dot, who did that work? Who did that work? Who gave me the IntelliSense? Go did. The remoted Go extension running in the container. So now the building and the running and the setting up of the machine is nothing. It's non-trivial. It's totally trivial, rather. Go isn't even installed on my computer. So then you ask yourself how you might do something like this with Visual Studio Code Spaces. If I can split Windows in half, why don't I split it in half and put one of them in the cloud? Maestro is saying basically the container is like WSL stuff before. The difference is the WSL stuff was metal, one piece of metal talking to another piece of metal in the sense of the persistent Windows file system and the persistent Windows environment was talking to the persistent WSL stuff. This one here is now in a container, except the container is not persistent. The container comes and goes. Containers get thrown away. So this workspaces folder is a volume mapping back over to the file system. The source code lives still on the D drive on my computer. So the source code did not move. And that allows me to do my work here. VS Code, there we go. So that work happens here, and it's the existence of the dev container right there that does this for me, which is fantastic. All right, cool. All right, friends on Zoom. I've only got a couple more minutes left because I actually am at work right now and I'm on my lunch hour. Maybe about 10 more minutes. How do we feel things are going? Mike, you feel good?
Yeah, this is good. There's been some great questions, and yeah, it's really interesting. And yeah,
seriously advanced stuff you've shown us there, Scott. That's been absolutely brilliant.
I hope someone was saying that they would have to play it back in half speed. I didn't mean to go too fast. There is a lot here. One of the things that's worth pointing out is that we have basically popped open the hood. What is it? The boot's the trunk. What do you call the front part of the car in the
bonnet?
The bonnet. We've popped the bonnet open on this thing, and we're standing in front of the car having a whole chat about what's underneath the bonnet. The fun part about this and the important part is that you don't need to know about what's under the bonnet in order to do your work. A regular person, this is really important. A regular Joe or Jane is just going to sit down and they're going to type code dot. They're going to run it, and it's just going to work. They'll have WSL by default because by then it'll be out. They'll go, oh, it's a dev container. They hit reopen. It'll spin up, right? It is very dense. Mr. Tortoise is saying, I didn't go too fast. It's just dense. Getting all this working and managing and guiding the product may have been an insane task. It has taken a while to get to this point, but let us remind ourselves what is necessary. So, Windows 2004, install WSL2, install Windows Terminal. All of these things could be installed by default. Put on Visual Studio Code, any version of that. Get some source. Put it on, whatever. Oh yeah, get a Linux, actually. Get a Linux. Put it on this, put it here. Go to here. Type code dot, and it should just work. You shouldn't have to do anything. So you can set that up in about an hour. Yeah. The VS Code WSL extension, that's a great point. VS Code is smart enough to do this for you. As soon as it sees that you have WSL, it will install the extensions that you need automatically. Good question. I don't have any examples of Oracle clients within WSL2 Maestro, but I will point out that it's just Linux, so it'll just work. It should just work. These things are, it's just Linux. So if it runs on Linux, 99% chance it'll run just fine here without too much trouble. Cool. Should give you a lot of really interesting ways to think and a lot of ways to work. And then the being able to go into code spaces is really interesting. This is where you can actually go into the browser, and then that container could then spin up in the cloud. So rather than you having a beefy machine like I do with a lot of cores, why not just put all the debuggers, the source, and everything in the cloud, and then just make an environment? And then the browser-based editor just kind of works. So actually, let me just even see if that works while people are asking questions here. I will go and log in. Oh yeah, RJ Perry is talking about WSL GUIs and stuff. Yes, if you want to do that. Adlang X is being salty. As per usual, my friend from Twitter, it ain't free. It isn't free, but it is charged by the second. So if you don't want to spend any money, suspend it. I sent my suspend after 30 minutes, but if you want to be really careful, you can actually just say after 5 minutes. Okay, so I can go and spin up this core here and say connect, and then we'll basically spin up an environment here. It's going to resume that space. So in a little bit, we'll spin up. You see Visual Studio Code's already starting to come up here. So the goal here is if you have a powerful machine, you can use it. If you don't have a powerful machine, you can rent one by the minute. So good stuff. Cool. Any other questions, my friends? Anyone on Zoom with a question? Ooh, stupid question, David Ballone. Now that we have Linux, what can we do we couldn't do before on Windows from a developer perspective? That's a great question. So the thing that I like about being able to do this stuff on Linux is when I'm out there in the world and I go and search for something, and I go and say, hey, how do I install Redis? I go and I search for Redis, and I go to a website, and I show up there, and it's like, yeah, how to install open source thing, right? And then you go to that web page, and then there's a $sign. And then it says typed apt install Redis server. And then I feel like I'm a Windows user. I'm like, oh, well, that kind of sucks. That's not for me. I'm not supposed to be here. Those days are over. Now I can have a Windows.net that talks to a Redis server on Linux that talks to Postgres. Reality is a hybrid. So what I can do now is I can do anything, anywhere, and I can also, in the very near future, run GUI applications on WSL as well. There's hacks to do it. We're going to make it official. You will be able to run Linux GUI apps on Windows. So yeah, Linux on the desktop is happening. It's just happening on the Windows desktop, which is pretty cool. The point is to be inclusive, that you don't want to have people feel like they can't do something. So hopefully in the future, if you're at a computer science 101 class, then you would just sit down and start typing at the command line. This right here, by the way, if you take a look, I'm now looking at some .NET code that I had left over from a couple weeks ago, and I'm in Visual Studio, except I'm in Visual Studio Online. All right. Isn't that cool? It's really actually in the browser. So theoretically, I mean, that could work on an iPad if the iPad had a better browser, but it certainly can work on a Chromebook. All right, good stuff.